Hi, my name is Steve Sharman. I'm a solutions architect at Cisco. In this first video on ACI interface configuration, I'm going to walk you through the simplest and easiest way to configure all the different access policies on your ACI fabric. Okay, the first thing to highlight is that there are a number of policies that need to be considered when configuring a Leaf interface on an ACI fabric. Second thing to consider is that Cisco leaves the naming structure entirely up to the network administrator, which frankly can lead to some real confusion and very odd naming structures. And finally, it's critical that all of the dots, or in the case of ACI, all the access policy relationships are linked up before an interface will become active. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I've stood up an APIC simulator. It's running 4.3q code, but you could run any version of code that you want. It's a completely new simulator. So if I look at the fabric membership, what you'll see, first of all, are the no nodes, and there is a node that's pending registration. What we'll do now is we'll hop over to the access policies and we'll start configuring all of these different policies that we looked at previously. We'll look at the pools, the VLAN pools, we'll look at the domains, the AEPs, the interface policy groups, the policies, etc., etc. So when we come to configure the access policies, we could start anywhere on this tree, at the top with the switch profiles or at the bottom with the VLAN pools. What I'm going to do though is start here with a leaf profile, and this is a definition of how I want a leaf switch to be configured, as in how do I want the interfaces to be configured on a given switch. I'm going to make a profile for every switch that I've got on my network, and also a profile for the VPC pair of switches as well. Now, in future videos, we'll look at this in more detail, how we can do this in maybe a more complex way, but this is the easy way. So I'm going to have a profile per switch and per pair of switches on my fabric. The next thing that I need to do is to actually tie that profile to a switch itself. So to do this, I go up to the switches at the top, into my leaf switches, create a profile, and again, I'm going to call this exactly the same naming structure as I created previously. So this is going to be Leaf 101, Leaf 102, 101 and 102, etc. And what I'm going to do now is actually tie it to that interface selector profile that I previously configured. Now at this point, if this were a real fabric, you would actually tie it also to your switches. But as this is just a simulator and we're just playing around with the policies, I'm not actually going to tie it to any switches because, as you saw previously, they weren't registered. But what we'll do is we'll just complete this. So I'm going to go through for switch 2, switch 101 and 102, etc., etc. And then we've got our one-to-one mapping made from our leaf profile, so the definition of how I want them to look, and the switches themselves, so the physical tin that this profile will be tied to. So now we can see that I've got all of my leaf profiles and all of the interface selectors are a nice simple one-to-one mapping between them. Now, if this were a real fabric, the next thing I would obviously want to do is to configure the VPC. So between switches 1 and 2, between switches 3 and 4, I want to put those into a VPC pair. Now, because this is a simulator and I don't even have any switches registered, I can't actually do this. So if I go to add or create a VPC pair, you'll see there's no switches registered to the APIC. But what we can do is we can run a quick playbook. So I've got an Ansible playbook here that will just go and configure the VPC pairs so that you can see exactly how it should look if this were a real network and they were configured correctly. The virtual IP address over on the right-hand side would be automatically pushed by APIC, so it would create that peer automatically. And then you would have your VPC configured between those two switches. So now that I've got the basic configuration in, as in I've got a profile, a definition of how I want my switch to look, and I've tied that to a switch. I've got my VPC configuration configured as well. I'm going to start with the rest of the build out. And the way I'm going to do this is start at the bottom and create a VLAN pool. Now I'm just going to have a single VLAN pool because this is the simple way of doing things. It's going to be called all VLANs. It's a dynamic pool, and I'm just going to give it a range of VLANs. And the reason that I give it a range of VLANs is so that these could be used or pushed automatically into VMware, for example, if we've got VMM integration, or I could push them if I need to do a service graph integration. What I'm also going to do is configure a static VLAN in this pool as well. It's for all of my VLANs. So I'm going to add in a legacy VLAN 10. And that's my first pool, and in this example, my only pool created. The next thing I need to do is to create a domain, and the domain is where I'm going to use these VLANs. And I'm going to use these VLANs for all of my physical devices that I'm going to attach to the network. And what you'll see is that I'll just tie this domain to that VLAN pool that I previously configured. And at that point, I've got that first mapping done. My VLAN pool to my domain is done. I'll get rid of the default physical domain. Next thing that I need to do is configure an AAEP. And you can think of this as like a switch port trunk allowed VLAN, if you like a traditional network naming. What I'm going to do here is just call it all allowed VLANs. I'm going to tie this to my physical domain that I just created, so all physical devices, which in turn was tied down to the VLAN pool. And as I mentioned previously, we do need to ensure that all of these objects are tied up throughout the configuration. So I've got my AAEP, that's all configured, it's tied to the domain. The next thing that I want to do is now go and configure some interface policies. So configuration that I want to apply to an interface. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a policy for CDP. I'm going to call it CDP enabled. I don't like to use the default policies because they're just called default, which doesn't help me when I come to troubleshoot. So I like to create explicit policies for the things that I'm going to use on the network. So I'll create another policy for LACP mode active, and I'm going to use this for my port channel configuration that we'll look at shortly. So now that I've got some interface configuration policies available to me, what I'm going to do next is to actually configure a policy group. And a policy group is just an aggregation of those policies, so CDP enabled, LACP active, etc. And I'm going to tie those to the VLANs through my AEP. So the first one I'm going to create is just an external router. I've got CDP enabled, tied to all of my VLANs. So that's the first one. Any access port policy you can use repeatedly, whereas any port channel or VPC policy has to be a one-to-one mapping. So the next one I'll do is configure a policy for my ESX host. And then finally, I'm going to create a one-to-one mapping of VPC policy that I'm going to tie to my Nexus 7K that's outside of my fabric. So this policy group is just a template that I can then apply to the different switches, or in this case, to the different logical representation of a switch. So I'll go to switch 1, and the first thing that I need to do is pick an interface. And let's give you some real world feedback, I guess. I've seen some very odd naming structures that customers have deployed when they're configuring these interfaces. So because this is the simple way of doing things, what I'm going to do is configure an interface. I'm going to call it Ethernet 6 because it's going to be port 6 on the switch. And I'm going to say port 6 on the switch is going to be used for my external router. The next thing I want to do is to actually put a description on there. So in this case, this is for an ASR 1K. And this is so that when I do a show interface Ethernet 1/6, it will actually give me that description as well. Now for switches 1 and 2, I want to configure port 10 exactly the same. So it's going to be used for my ESX host, and I'll give it a name. And I'm going to configure port 11 also for my ESX host. So this is configuring 2 ports on both switches at the same time. Again, I'll just give it a description. So once that's done, I'll do the same thing for switches 3 and 4. So I'm going to configure ports 1/10 on switch 3 and 4 and 1/11 on switches 3 and 4. Now it's important to note that these aren't port channels, these are just pushing the same configuration to 2 ports on 2 switches that's tied to this ESX policy group that I've previously configured. The last thing that I'm going to do is actually configure port 20 for a VPC. So again, on switches 3 and 4, I'm going to push port 20, or the configuration for port 20 is going to leverage that LACP active policy that's contained within that VPC policy group, and that's going to be pushed to port 20 on both switches. And you should really try and, wherever possible, have a symmetrical configuration within your network. So I'm using the same switch ports on both switches. This makes it much easier to actually do the configuration, and it's a much quicker way of doing the configuration. Once this is complete, if I look at my profiles, what I can see is for switch 1, I can see that I've got port 6 configured for my ASR. For switches 1 and 2, I've got port 10 and port 11 configured, and on switches 3 and 4, I've got port 10, port 11, and port 20 configured. So it gives me a very simple and easy way to actually look at the network just at my leaf profile, so that the logical definition of how I want my switches to be configured. I can look at this and straight away see how the different interfaces are configured on each of the switches that I've got. So just to wrap up, if you want to configure the interfaces on your ACI fabric in the simplest, easiest, and most flexible way possible, I would strongly suggest creating a one-to-one mapping between the leaf profile definition and the physical switch. This will allow you to configure any port on any switch for any attached device. I'd also strongly recommend adopting a simple, clear naming convention for all the different policies that are used on the network. Don't go with the default policies that are called default, because that doesn't really help when you come to troubleshoot. Hope you found this video useful. Please look out for the next video where I'll look at alternative ways to configure the leaf profiles. And thanks for watching.